a negotiation. When you cross the street is a negotiation. Getting your coffee at Starbucks.
In 1942, Albert Einstein was teaching at Oxford University, and one day he just gave an exam of physics to the senior class of physics students. And he was walking on the campus with his assistant, and all of a sudden the assistant looked at Albert Einstein and said, "Dr. Einstein, this exam which you just gave to the senior class of physics students, isn't that exactly the same exam you gave to exactly the same class 1 year ago?" Yeah, said Albert Einstein, it's exactly the same. "But Dr. Einstein, how could you possibly do that?" the assistant said. "Well," said Einstein, "the answers have changed." The answers have changed. In other words, what is true for 1942 is even more true for today. We live in a world where the questions might be the same, but the answers have changed. In other words, what has got you here will no longer get you there. And if you want to have results that you've never had before, well, you need to start doing things you've never done before. Now, the key question for today is, of course, is there a method to the madness? Is there a way that each of us can do impossible things to truly create dramatic results? And good news is that the answer to that question is yes. Because what I'm going to explain today is, when it comes to high performance, why the majority is always wrong, and how you can use that to get everything you can out of everything you've got. But let me first introduce you to something interesting, an interesting observation. When people, teams, and organizations, whenever they hit a wall, they tend to do one of two things. They either do more of the same things, or they do less of the same things. But what you very seldom see is that they start to do different things instead. And it's interesting, if you look at the data, approximately 3% of people are inclined to even do different things. And the remaining 97% continues to smash into the wall like some kind of crazy energy bunny on stilts. Why is that? Why is it? And to understand what's going on here, we need to ask ourselves another question. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is the purpose of thinking? What is the purpose of thinking? Now, if you ask that question to a brain scientist, the brain scientist will say, well, the purpose of thinking is to stop thinking. The purpose of thinking is to stop thinking. Now, what does she mean by that? Well, here's the thing. Thinking is a high energy activity. It takes a lot of energy to think. So whenever we think, we try to think as short as possible, and then we return to automatic pilot. Over 95% of our life we run on automatic pilot. For example, if you've ever driven a car and then you realize, whoa, what did I do in the past half an hour? That's your brain on automatic pilot. Another example, many of you right now are listening to me on automatic pilot. And I know who you are. Now, here's the thing. If your brain is an automatic pilot, this leads to what the scientists call mental myopia, also known as tunnel vision. And if you have tunnel vision, that's a bit of a problem, because it confuses people about their own performance. And this is the reason that many people go through life acting like a mediocre race car driver, who sits in his car, looks in his rear view mirror, sees his competition, and is so far behind that they think they are first. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, we tend to think inside the box, and the box is a very good metaphor here. So let me draw a box. And if you take a close look at the box, you see that the boundaries of this box are very well defined. So we think inside defined boundaries. I'll give you an example. One boundary is a legal boundary, and we think within the legal framework. I'll give you an example. Very few of you would think of stealing the wallet of the person next to you in order to fund your next cool startup. At least that's what I hope. So we think in legal boundaries, but there are other boundaries as well. We think in technological boundaries, we think in physical boundaries, but we also think in moral boundaries. And this is why we think inside the box. At least, that's what we think. Because the reality is that the box in which we think looks more like this. Now, for those of you in the back who cannot see it, the reason is this is a very small box. And let me illustrate how small this box can be. For example, if I would say tonight, let's have something to eat, have dinner tonight, what would be options to do that? Probably you can come up with, hey, let's buy some pizza, go to a restaurant, cook at home, all kind of cool ideas. But I believe that very few of you would raise their hand and say, hey, let's go to the highway close by, see if we can pick up some dead animals on the side of the road and prepare ourselves a crispy dinner. That's a disturbing thought. But here's the funny thing, for many people in the world, this would be a perfectly normal response. Nothing wrong with that. So what it shows is that the box in which we think is actually very, very small. And if you take a close look at your industry or professional field, you also think inside a very small box. And the boundaries of this box, they are called industry standards or industry norms. For example, if you are in the restaurant business, then the industry standard is that people come to your establishment, they eat, and then they pay. That's the standard. That's how everyone is doing it. Another example, if you are in the banking business, this norm is that people give you money, you say thank you very much, and you give the money to someone else. I mean, that's banking. So those are standards, those are norms in the industry or professional field. But this is what you need to know. The word norm is an abbreviation for normal. In other words, if you do what everyone else is doing, you get results that everyone else is getting, and those are normal results. And the thing is, what we are after today are extraordinary results. So the key question is, of course, how can you kick yourself out of the box? Out of this very small box of your industry and professional field and move to the happy place where cool innovation happens. Now, how can you do that? Now, let me introduce you the curious case of the London taxi drivers. If you want to become a taxi driver in London, you need to know the entire city by heart. And this is called the knowledge. You can imagine it takes years to get the knowledge in your head. And that's a bit of a problem if you want to rapidly expand your taxi business. So they ask themselves a question. How can we rapidly expand our taxi business while at the same time employing taxi drivers who do not know anything about the city of London? And then they came up with a very ingenious solution. What they said, well, actually, then we make two kinds of taxis. One is a normal taxi, and the other taxi has a big sign on it which says, the driver of this vehicle does not know anything about the city of London, but loves to get directions from you. And that's a brilliant solution, because this attracted those people who lived in London, knew the city very well, and finally could pay boss in a taxi. Yeah. Brilliant. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this sounds like a very cute story. But there's much more than meets the eye. Because what we have found is that breakthrough innovation, extraordinary results happen when people decide to finally break the standards or the norms in their industry or professional field. And you see that over and over again. For example, if you would have a furniture business and one day you would decide to no longer assemble furniture for your customers, probably you would end up with a company called IKEA. Yeah. Another example, if you own a computer business and one day you would decide to no longer sell your computer using a physical store, probably you would end up with a company called Dell Computers. Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, what it tells us, there is a method to the madness. And by understanding that the majority is always wrong when it comes to high performance, finally you have the opportunity to Quit fixing things and move to massive innovation instead. Ladies and gentlemen, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius once said that the object of life is not to side with the majority, but the object of life is to escape finding oneself joining the ranks of the clinically insane. If you do what everyone else is doing, you're not distinguishing yourself and you're probably stuck. And this is why, when it comes to high performance, the majority is always wrong. This is what we know. We know that
The Line program is a master's in computer science program for people who haven't studied
We see it every day in the news for the past decade, the battles that are being waged across the Middle East on the instant updates through satellites to give us a front row seat into the action like never before. But what the cameras don't capture is that there is another war going on beneath the surface, a digital cyber world, where the battles are not being fought with bombs and bullets, but with bits and bytes. My name is not Doug Schmidt. But it could be if I wanted it to. My real name is Eric Winsborough, and for the past 2 decades, I've been involved in creating the next generation disruptive technologies at companies.
So, for most of my life, I've been obsessed with the digital revolution. That may sound strange coming from an actor-director, but actually, I blame the Bill and Ted movies for my obsession with technology. You see, one day in the late 80s, I woke up with my face on a cereal box. Yeah. When the first Bill and Ted opened, my life became permanently public. Grocery shopping had to be done in the middle of the night. A crowded subway was a no-go zone. And a teenage fan ran away from home, crossed the country by bus, and parked herself at my front door. Thankfully, I was out of town. Now, don't get me wrong. I was very grateful for the success of those movies. But like many young people thrust into the spotlight, I was unprepared for a life that suddenly lacked any degree of privacy and anonymity. And that's when I discovered the internet. Specifically, the anonymous online communities that existed in the crude early days of the net before the existence of the modern web that we know today. Believe it or not, here were thousands of people around the world meeting in online news groups and chat rooms to discuss a wide range of interests and connect with each other. Many of us using anonymous usernames and even encrypted email. There had never been anything like this, and it blew my mind. I may have come to the anonymous internet for privacy, but I stayed for the community. A vibrant network where I could say what I wanted and be myself. It was a very liberating experience, whether or not your face was on a cereal box. So I've since spent a lot of time investigating the evolution of online communities. Who builds them? What motivates their creation? And how these often radical technologies are changing the world. And that led me to make a documentary called Deep Web. Now, this movie mostly examines the Silk Road, which was an anonymous online marketplace and forum that existed in a hidden area of the internet and used Bitcoin, an unregulated digital currency. Now, the Silk Road sold many things, but mostly drugs, including illegal drugs. This is a heated subject, and for the most part, the media covered it in a highly salacious manner. The headlines screamed about a shadowy internet filled with guns and drugs and hitmen. The further I investigated it, the more I realized it was largely inaccurate. You see, what compelled me to spend several years immersed in the area of the Silk Road and the hidden internet was a desire to discover what, if anything, they mean to the average citizen. And it turns out they mean a great deal. So let's start with the basics. What is this hidden internet exactly? Now, the media coverage of the deep web usually describes it as a vast hidden area, 5,000 times larger than the surface web and filled with criminals. But that is actually false. The deep web is not a place, is not hidden, and actually harbors zero criminal activity. It simply accounts for the unindexed content online, the raw data that Google doesn't know about and doesn't care about. For example, your online banking data is not stored anywhere on Google, and your company may have an internal network that you use to communicate. This exists in the deep web. But there is a hidden internet, a tiny little area called the darknet, or dark web. And this small corner of the internet is comprised primarily of information that is actively hidden from public view, and this is the area worth talking about. So, the darknet, it can only be accessed by specific tools, like Tor, which is a special browser and service that masks your browsing activity and gets you into the darknet. Will you find crime? Yes, but not to the degree that the media has claimed, and crime is neither the primary use of the darknet nor why it was built. Now, the internet was originally funded by the Department of Defense, and as it became publicly facing with the World Wide Web, new technologies were created to ensure its use for defense. So really, the darknet is just another tool, and it's used by government agencies all over the world, along with journalists, dissidents in countries with hostile governments, whistleblowers, and just regular folks who want to create and utilize anonymous online communities like the ones I spent so much time in back in the late 80s. And like any place where human beings congregate, there is illegal activity. So let's look at that. There are black markets selling drugs, and many of these, most of these, like the Silk Road, primarily sell marijuana. Altogether, they represent a small fraction of the physical drug trade. Guns? Yes, guns have been sold on the darknet, though not effectively. Sadly, why would you want to hassle with the darknet when you can buy a semi-automatic rifle anywhere, from Walmart to Instagram? There is child pornography on the darknet, though significantly less than is available on the surface web. And contrary to popular mythology, there is no tangible evidence that actual legitimate hitmen services have ever been offered on the darknet, or that significant terrorist activity has either, though there are hoax sites that claim these services. It will come as no surprise, but hoax and scam sites proliferate on the darknet, operated both by law enforcement to lure the incautious digital criminal, and by internet trolls who want to profit on this deep web hysteria. So, there are dark things on the darknet, though considerably less than is being reported, and law enforcement is all over it. The truth is the darknet is a terrible place to conduct crime. It's difficult to get into the darknet, and it's cumbersome to navigate once you're in. And by nature, digital criminals are amongst the most easily tracked and caught. It's very hard to remain anonymous on the internet, where the slightest mistake can expose your entire history of activity. Similarly, digital currencies like Bitcoin are horrible tools for crime. While they are capable of being anonymized, by nature, they are the least anonymous form of currency that exists, with every single transaction being permanently recorded in a digital ledger. And the internet never forgets. So, why the cyberspin and hysteria in the media? Well, it sells. It's good for clickbait. It makes for, sexy TV shows and movies. It sells magazines. But there is another agenda at work: to demonize the darknet and to scare people away from it. Now, who would want to do that? People in power who believe that the privacy and anonymity that the darknet enables will cause them to lose control. And that's where the Silk Road comes in. Because however you choose to judge it, one of the chief motives for its creation was to fight back against that control. Now, there's a lot about the Silk Road we'll never know, because it was built and operated in a hidden area of the internet by anonymous users. But we do know that in 2011, a young physics grad student from Austin, Texas, named Ross Ulbricht, created this online market. It was a brilliant combination of Tor, which hid the site's location, and Bitcoin. Now, Ulbricht claims he created the Silk Road as an economic experiment, a test case to create an online market and forum that would allow its users to congregate with total freedom and anonymity. That is a radical idea. But as a technology service, it was a watershed. and the Silk Road immediately attracted thousands of users. It also attracted law enforcement, who had infiltrated the Silk Road from the very beginning, and ultimately, Ross Ulbricht was arrested, tried, and convicted on a handful of charges, including computer hacking, drug trafficking, money laundering, and even a kingpin charge, which is usually reserved for massive drug cartels. There had been initial charges of attempted murder, but Ross Ulbricht was never indicted for any of those charges, and there are no murders that are believed to have been carried out. On May 29th of 2015, Ross Ulbricht was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, to many on the outside, the story of Silk Road and Ross Ulbricht was about nothing more than an online drug market that was shut down, with its creator severely punished for brazenly flaunting the law. But due to the relatively small amount of drugs being sold, and the fact that Ross Ulbricht was only charged with nonviolent offenses, many people were stunned by the extremely harsh sentence. It didn't seem to fit the narrative. However, to those of us who were closer to the events, it fit the narrative fine. It was just a different narrative. You see, another side of the story is that Ross Ulbricht found himself at the intersection of three of the most highly prosecuted areas of law in the United States today: cyber, the Silk Road angered a lot of people in power who feel threatened by the digital revolution in general and the darknet in the specific. Now, that was the narrative that I set out to tell in my film, and thankfully, due to my connections in this space and my experience with encryption, I was able to gain unprecedented access to the inner workings and architects of the Silk Road. And what I found surprised me. Every key player that I interviewed came from a political background: highly educated activists, significant members of the Occupy movement, radical crypto-anarchists, libertarians, etc. None of these people were taking this risk by participating in Silk Road simply to sell drugs. Some of them had no interest whatsoever in drugs. They wanted to build the first large-scale anonymous online community. They wanted to circumvent entities that breached their privacy. They wanted to fight back against the drug war. To put it simply, they were taking this risk, enormous risk, for their ideals. The truth about the Silk Road, as unpalatable as it may be, is that it was a political engine designed to enact change. That is not to exonerate this service, which was reckless and beyond the law, but simply to point out that for many of these people, they felt so strongly about these issues that they were willing to risk their freedom to fight for them. So, this is all very interesting, but what has any of it got to do with you? Well, many of you, I'm sure, have heard of recent hacks, like Ashley Madison, Target, Anthem Blue Cross, and Snapchat. And I'm sure privately, many of you were glad that they didn't happen to you. But here's another unpalatable truth. We have already been hacked. All of us. Our financial information, our medical records, our personal photographs, our browsing activity, our phone calls, our texts. All of this information is already out there in other people's hands. How did it get there? Through pervasive government surveillance and bulk collection, by black hat hackers who are pulling down your online information and the information of your banks, insurance companies, and other institutions. And by your internet service provider, your phone company, and other tech companies who routinely collect your information both with and without your permission, and whose basic functions track your every move, collect your data, and store your speech. I'm not talking about spyware, but common apps like Siri and Google Maps. The hard question in the digital age is not what do we do if our personal information gets out there, because for most of us, that's too late. The real question we face today is why should we care? As we're constantly told, if we have nothing to hide, we have nothing to fear. Now, here's a personal story. Like many of you have experienced, I recently had my credit card information stolen over the internet. And in this particular case, it turned out to be a couple of teenagers who were using my bank's money to play a lot of Xbox and order a lot of pizza. Now, that made me kind of paranoid. So I scanned my laptop and I found another breach in the form of malware. There's many different types of malware. This is what's called a keylogger, which records all of your keystrokes and your screen activity. Okay, I know what you're thinking. This guy spends a lot of time on the internet. But what about my wife's computer and my children? So I scanned those devices and I found more malware. So in the end, those Xbox and pizza kids were stopped and our computers were scrubbed of malware. No big deal, just a hassle. But it brought home our vulnerability, that our personal information is just sitting out there waiting to be exploited for whatever reason. And those reasons could range from a minor violation to destroyed lives. I don't accept the idea that if we have nothing to hide, we have nothing to fear. Privacy serves a purpose. It's why we have blinds on our windows and a door on our bathroom. Privacy is important to us. It's something that we take for granted as being central to our lives. In other words, we have plenty to hide. And it's always been our right to hide it, until now. Because today there are people who don't want us to protect our privacy, who want, and to a large degree, already have free access to our personal information. Again, I'm mostly talking about tech and phone companies, government and law enforcement, and black hat hackers. Now, how do they work to prevent us from our privacy? They propagate misinformation about privacy tools, and they demonize those tools and those who use them. They weaken the security of the internet with backdoors to gain access to our information, and they lie to the public about what information they're collecting and for what purpose. And this behavior has radicalized a generation. A growing movement of hackers, digital activists, and cryptographers who are fighting back. And some of these radical actors created and operated the Silk Road. Now, hearing all this, I'm sure that many of you would say, I'm willing to give up some of my freedom to have more security. And of course, we want law enforcement to be able to catch the bad guys. But there's two problems with this idea that less privacy makes for more security. The first is that there's no evidence this is the case. That government surveillance and backdoors that weaken the security of the internet make for greater security. It's a needle in a haystack approach, and it's highly questionable that it works better than a targeted approach. Law enforcement already has more than enough access for targeting and catching criminals in the digital space. This is, in many ways, the golden age of surveillance for law enforcement. The other problem with this idea that less privacy makes for more security is that weakening the security of the internet makes life easier for the bad guys. It's easier for hackers to access your information if you're unable to protect that information. And it's easier for digital criminals to breach. You wouldn't allow a cop to break into your house and rummage through your belongings, but that's just what's happening to your computer and your cell phone, devices that now contain your entire life. By the same token, corporations need to be able to conduct business and crunch their data with less access. And black hat hackers have to be met with airtight security tools, not weakened ones. But how on earth do we go about achieving all this? It requires the very thing these people are most afraid of. We need to go dark. To go dark means that everyone would be utilizing privacy and anonymity tools at all times. Tools like Tor and virtual private networks that protect your browsing activity just as they protect darknet sites like Silk Road. PGP and encryption services that keep emails private. And fully encrypted phone calls and texts. Now, these services used to be difficult for the average user, but that's changing. The desire for privacy and security in the digital space is becoming big business. You may not realize this, but Apple's iMessages are now encrypted, where it used to be that anyone could access your text messages. And now websites are usually using secure connections by default. And that's just the beginning. It's now been over 30 years since I first discovered the power and the value of anonymous online communities. But this journey was made urgent by my recent exploration of the darknet. We need a hidden internet, just as we need all the tools and services that protect our privacy and anonymity. As we move further forward into the technological era, and our lives and our world continue to radically change, we have to recognize that both our individual and collective existence depend upon a base level of control over our own privacy. Privacy is not a privilege, and it is not something to be willingly and casually sacrificed. Privacy is fundamental to being a human being, and it's worth fighting for. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mike and I'm an addict. And 16 years ago, my daily habit was to use alcohol and drugs from the minute I woke up to the minute I passed out at night. All I wanted to do was get and stay high. I was kicked out of school, couldn't keep a job, I was kicked out of my house. I didn't even have any money, and so the only money I could get was what I stole from my friends. I didn't even have a belt. I had to use a piece of rope to hold my pants up. And my story is not unique. 46% of adults say they have a friend or family member that's addicted to alcohol or drugs, and that was me. And I truly believed that I would be dead by the time I was 30. So I know after saying all this, what I'm about to believe leaders should run their organizations like addicts. Addicts aren't like everybody else. We use all the time or we can't use it all. So we have to do recovery the same way, every single day. And when I got clean, they told me there were 3 principles that were so important, if I didn't practice them on a daily basis, I wouldn't live. They told me I had to practice rigorous authenticity, I had to surrender the outcome, and I had to do uncomfortable work. Now, these principles didn't just keep me alive. This story isn't about how I overcame addiction and despite that went on to become successful. This story is about why addiction is the entire reason for my success. And so for me, my story starts in 12-step recovery, and I went to meetings. And what we do in meetings is we share. When I got there, I wanted to be the best addict, so I shared to impress everybody, and I pretended that I'd mastered these 3 principles even though I didn't understand them. Well, after months of this, one time I came into the meeting with so much pain, I knew if I didn't share real, I would relapse. And so I shared vulnerably, emotionally, messy. I was all over the place. It was the opposite of impressive. After the meeting, another addict came up to me. His name was Tim. He was a guy with 15 years clean, and he was a biker with a goatee. He was a little intimidating. And he said, "Mike, that was the best share you've ever done." I was like, "Tim, dude, that was the worst share I've ever done. What are you talking about, man?" He's like, "No, that was the first real share that you've ever done." That's what we do here. Keep doing that and you'll stay clean. That was the first time anyone had ever told me being authentic was impressive. It was also the first time I stood that close to a man in head-to-toe Harley leather. I didn't even know that they made clothes. Had to become a drug addict to find that out. So it was one thing to practice these principles in the meetings. It was another thing to do it out in the real world. And when I got clean, I also entered a halfway house. And when I walked in, the house manager told me that I had 5 business days to get a job or they would kick me out. Now I'm sitting there and I'm wondering, what is a business day? Because I'm an addict, I don't know. And then I started thinking, I haven't had a job in 3 years. How am I going to find one in 5 days? But I went looking, and I saw an opening at a Sam Goody. Now, Sam Goody was a CD store, and for those of you who don't remember CDs, it's basically a brick and mortar Spotify. And I'd worked at one before, and so I applied, and in my application, I left the last 3 years blank because I was pretty sure if I wrote I did a lot of drugs, they weren't going to give me the job. Back at the halfway house, I call my sponsor because I'm worried about the interview, and I say, what am I going to tell them when they ask me about the 3-year gap in my resume? And he said, Mike, it's really simple. Tell them the truth. Okay. I was like, Chuck, I love your commitment to these 3 principles, man. That's great in the meetings, but we're out in the real world, buddy. If I tell them I'm an addict, I'm not going to get the job and I'll be out in the streets, so what do I say? And he said, Mike, this isn't about the job. It's not even about the halfway house. It's about, are you willing to be authentic, surrender the outcome, and do uncomfortable work no matter what? This is about, do you want to stay clean?
The last time I heard my son's voice was when he walked out the front door on his way to school. He called out one word in the darkness: "Bye." It was April 20th, 1999. Later that morning at Columbine High School, my son Dylan and his friend Eric killed 12 students and a teacher and wounded more than 20 others before taking. 18 innocent people were killed, leaving their loved ones in a state of grief and trauma. Others sustained injuries, some resulting in disfigurement and permanent disability. But the enormity of the tragedy can't be measured only by the number of deaths and injuries that took place. There's no way to quantify the psychological damage of those who were in the school or who took part in rescue or cleanup efforts. There's no way to assess the magnitude of a tragedy like Columbine, especially when it can be a blueprint for other shooters who go on to commit atrocities of their own. Columbine was a tidal wave, and when the crash ended, it would take years for the community and for society to comprehend its impact. It has taken me years to try to accept my son's legacy. The cruel behavior that defined the end of his life showed me that he was a completely different person from the one I knew. Afterwards, people asked, "How could you not know? What kind of a mother were you?" I still ask myself those same questions. Before the shootings, I thought of myself as a good mom, helping my children become caring, healthy, responsible adults was the most important role in my life. But the tragedy convinced me that I failed as a parent, and it's partially this sense of failure that brings me here today. Aside from his father, I was the one person who knew and loved Dylan the most. If anyone could have known what was happening, it should have been me, right? But I didn't know. Today I'm here to share the experience of what it's like to be the mother of someone who kills and hurts. For years after the tragedy, I combed through memories, trying to figure out exactly where I failed as a parent. But there are no simple answers. I can't give you any solutions. All I can do is share what I have learned. When I talk to people who didn't know me before the shootings, I have 3 challenges to meet. First, when I walk into a room like this, I never know if someone there has experienced loss because of what my son did. I feel a need to acknowledge the suffering.
If I gave you an automated Amazon business that made you $100,000 per month in less than
7 years ago, a student came to me and asked me to invest in his company. He said, "I'm working with 3 friends, and we're going to try to disrupt an industry by selling stuff online." And I said, "Okay, you guys spent the whole summer on this, right?" "No, we all took internships, just in case it doesn't work out." "All right, but you're going to go in full time."
Let this be an adventure in learning together. I want you to think of somebody in your life who has helped you to define who you are. and whom you feel a sense of deep gratitude in your heart for. Take a moment to think of this person or persons and take a moment to thank them. Today I'm going to tell you that the most important part of all of learning is an answer to 3 questions. The meaning of all of education, doesn't matter what you study, is who are you? Why are you here? And what will you do with this knowledge once you answer this question, who am I and why am I here? Who am I is about truly honoring the gifts that you have. Why am I here is to honor your inner calling, which appears to you when you care to listen deeply. And when you understand your true gifts and your true calling and combine the two, you do your best work. And when you enable others to do that, you truly practice inclusive leadership and diversity. And that's what some of us call inspired leadership. I wanted to understand what inspired you.
Now, I know there are other nationalities here. I'm a Ghanaian, by the way. But then again, judging from the immigration trends, I might as well, you know, and that applies to just about. But I often get mistaken as a Nigerian, and look, I'm incredibly proud to be a Ghanaian. My grandfather composed Ghana's national anthem. But in 1957, when Nkrumah said to my grandfather, who was a music teacher at the time, that we need a new national anthem, my grandfather wrote Ghana's national anthem. However, my mother tells me, she's gone now, but Mommy tells me that there was a day they were in a shop called Leventis. I don't think that still works anymore. Yeah. And Grandpa was singing another song. And she asked him, Daddy, what's this song for? And he said, oh, I'm writing a song for Nigeria when they become independent. The point he was making is that these borders and these nationalities and these things that we hold so closely are slowly beginning to become less and less important. And if you're from South Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, don't worry, I do the same thing everywhere else I go. No, but the truth is that it happens all the time. Everyone thinks I'm a Nigerian. I walk into, you know, TM Lewin and, you know. I hear we've now moved to Hackett. It's Hackett, yeah. It happens fairly frequently. I mean, I'll tell you the best I thought you were a Nigerian story was, I was at the Dorchester. A good friend of mine, a wonderful woman called Eleni Gabremedi, works in Ethiopia, set up the commodities exchange. They said, come over, there's an event here, I need an escort. And I said, yeah, no problem. And by the way, by escort, I mean the African version. I mean African escort, as in I was escorting her. So now you know. So I was escorting Eleni, who's a fantastic woman. And when I was there, I met another woman who I truly admire and I've always looked forward to interviewing. And that's the Nigerian Finance Minister, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Amazing lady. So I walk up to Madame Ngozi and said, hello, Madame, I'm Kola from the BZ. She looked at me and said, oh, Kola, how are you? And I said, you know, excuse me, ma, but, you know, I'm from Ghana. She said, really? And you're so confident. And that's a true story. I have a few friends who were there. And, you know, and you would think, for a minute, I wasn't too sure whether to feel insulted or... But she meant it in a good way. And it's so funny that, you know, a few weeks later, I was doing a sit-down with Baba, or General Obasanjo, as you know him. And I narrated this story, and then he paused and looked at me and said, what's your problem? So I take it from all sides, but, you know, I am a Ghanaian, very proud to be one, but because of what I do increasingly, it's become less and less important for me. Over the past 2.5 years, I think I've had possibly the best job at the BBC. I was hosting a program called Africa Business Report. Every week for 2.5 years, I would travel to a different African country, doing exclusively stories about business, opportunity, entrepreneurs. As a result, I have a lot of air miles. But I also have, even as an African, a better understanding of the continent that I come from. I can travel to Windhoek, Swakopmund, Maputo, Luanda, and I have people, I have friends there, and I have a better understanding of the continent. So how does that translate into how the BBC or international media cover Africa? Let's begin. Talking about Africa has become, I think, quite popular these days. Everyone's kind of coming to the party, even though some of the people at the party already knew the party was there and still kind of started, you know. But everyone's kind of like, yeah, you know, Africa's, you know. So there's The Economist sometime last year. There's Time Magazine this year with the same headline, you know. Quite original. But there comes a point in every professional's career or anyone who's dealing with Africa that they realize that it's not the same and the story cannot be told in the same way. And this book, and there you can see me posing on the cover, it's written by a good friend of mine called Charles Robertson, and you know, this really distills all the information about Africa and things, and it's a great cover as well, but it really contains a lot of detail about how Africa is changing. This is where it happened for me. 2009, that's a diamond worth several $100,000. I was in Botswana. Empty building, not much going on there. It was called the Diamond Hub. Walked around, you know, Botswana is the biggest producer of gem diamonds. You know that. But the dilemma facing Botswana and many African countries is you produce these raw gem diamonds, make $4 or $5 billion a year from sales. But the diamond industry itself is $50–60 billion a year. So these raw diamonds get shipped to Antwerp and to Asia, and they get cut, and you know, rich Nigerians go and buy the diamonds somewhere in London or wherever it may be. So there's your Diamond Hub. This man is Dr. Akolong Tombale. He was the head of the Diamond Hub, and I went there to interview him, and this is what he told me. He said, we are teaching our people how to cut diamonds. That's all we're doing right now. teaching our people, and there they are, learning how to cut diamonds. And this was the beginning, just a few months old, the Diamond Hub. Fast forward to this year. Did anyone see the story in the Financial Times about De Beers and... Yeah, okay, well, I'll tell you, because it kind of slipped under the radar. De Beers has moved its trading operation to Habaroni. Did you know this? Well, it was on the BBC, so... So it brings me to another interesting point before we get to this. There's always that moment when you realize that, no, Africa, things are really going on. I have a great friend, his name is Sebastian. Sebastian works in South Africa for a multinational bank. And every time I'm going to South Africa, I call up Seb, and we were roommates in college. He chose a different path. So I call up Sebastian, and Sebastian says, what time will you be in? And I'll say, oh, I'll be in at, 9 o'clock, Virgin flight, blah, blah, blah. And I get there, and there's a brand new Mercedes waiting, and, drive off to his place in some gated community in Sandton. And then Sebastian calls me and says, come on, I'm coming to London, oh. So yeah, bro. He arrives at the airport, and I say, take the Heathrow Express. And then the Bakerloo line, and But the best part is recently, sometime this year, and Seb is doing incredibly well, and Seb calls me up and says, Kumla, Chale, trouble. I said, what's the problem? What's the problem? I thought things were going great. He says, man, boy, they want to transfer me to London. And that's a true story. But increasingly, you're finding African professionals who really, they're building fantastic lives and opportunities on the continent. And what London used to be is not necessarily, it's not the same anymore. So Seb comes to visit and has a good time and he's off. And I think for many professionals here, you can relate that you are no longer limited to working in the city. You are now talented and capable enough to work anywhere in the world, including in Africa. And the reason why it's so important is because all of you have what I call institutional knowledge, or what my good friend and mentor Lise Doucette says, you've tasted the dust in the alleyways, so you know how to get around. And so it brings me to my point. In 2012 and beyond, whether you're international media or you're a business professional, how must things change in terms of how you cover the continent? And there's my point number one. There has to be balance, or what I say, please don't patronize me. Okay, where's that? I've given enough props to Nigeria. It's been this enough. Where do you think this is? Okay, I'll tell you. This is Luanda. Yeah, that's Luanda. That's Angola. That's Luanda as well. However, that's also Luanda. Less than 5 kilometers away from those posh yachts, all those expensive restaurants. This is Luanda too. So the question I put to you is, what story should you tell? Yes, there's a lot of good news about Africa, but there has to be balance. And all of you recognize when you're being patronized, when you're being told things are perfect when they are not. Everybody wants balance. So in this case, if I'm going to Luanda to talk about economic growth hitting 10% over 10 years and wealth, I have an obligation to tell this story as well. I'll tell you about this lady. I did an interview with her, asked her about, Angola's economic growth and stuff, and she said, well, to give you this interview, you have to do something for me. And I was thinking, oh, I'm going to have to pay her or something, and we're not allowed to do that. But she came up with a better idea. She spends 2 hours there fetching water, so she gave me a wheelbarrow as punishment. so I ended up, in exchange for the interview, I had to fetch water for a few hours. So, point number 2, when in doubt, ask an Africa expert. This is one of my favorite ones. Who really is an Africa expert? How would you feel if you're watching me on telly one morning and, good morning, my
I would totally get my degree if I could like set my own hours. Boom, log in. I would totally.
Good afternoon. I'm Sangeet Chopra from Cybercure Technologies. I am the ethical hacker by profession. Now, this word hacker is itself having a negative impression, or you can say perception. Yes or no? Right? When I talk about a hacker, people see a guy sitting with a hood on a laptop and hacking someone's account, right? That is what you imagine. But that's not the case. I'm an ethical hacker. Now, this ethical and hacker are two words that are contradictory. How come hacking can be ethical, right? So problem is people actually do not know the meaning of hacking. People do not know the actual meaning of hacking, right? Every day we get news, we see print media, something that Gmail got hacked, Yahoo got hacked, Snapchat got hacked. Now we had some speakers, dignitaries who spoke about their portals, as in there was a guy from CoCubes, right? He have an online portal on which he's having his business, right? We had someone else, I forgot the name.
spoken on our planet daily. And these thousands of languages serve thousands of cultures, from the smallest community to the largest continent. Now, even with this vast diversity among our global population, we have some alternative languages and methods for communication that are understood by everybody. For example, the world has mathematics. If I have one apple and somebody gives me another apple, I have two apples. This is understood worldwide without fail. Now, as of today, the largest culture by far is that of the internet user. With 7.6 billion humans on Earth, around 3.6 billion of us are online and communicating with each other and institutions daily. Thus, another common language we all share, but most don't realize, is the networking protocols that the internet runs on and the social media platforms that tie us together, and emojis. We can't forget the emojis. But what our internet culture tends to lack is a common understanding to foster true understanding about cybersecurity and threats online. Outside of hardcore cybersecurity and IT people like myself, most people don't understand the language that is nerd. And so it is my job to be the best nerd to English translator I can be in order to help the world stay safe online.